The wind, a relentless predator, clawed at Ilara's threadbare shawl, its icy talons seeking the warmth she no longer possessed. It shrieked across the barren, frost-hardened plains, a symphony of desolation that mirrored the hollow ache in her chest. Before her, the last flickering embers of hope had been brutally extinguished, stamped out by the heavy boots and harder faces of the settlers in the fledgling township of Redemption. Redemption! The name was a bitter irony that clung to her tongue like ash. They had offered none. Only suspicion, fear, and finally, a cold, unyielding rejection. Her wagon, a dilapidated relic of a life abruptly severed, stood as a monument to her failure, its meager contents a testament to their dwindling chances. Her husband, Thomas, good, kind Thomas, lay buried miles back, a victim of the fever that had swept through their small, independent party, leaving Ilara widowed and her twin daughters, Leah and Mara, fatherless in this unforgiving expanse. The memory of his last, rasping breath was a fresh wound, raw and bleeding, exacerbated by the cruelty she had just endured. "We've got our own to feed," the self-appointed mayor had declared, his eyes, small and hard as flint, flicking over her girls with a complete lack of compassion. No room for extra mouths, especially ones that might carry sickness or bad luck. Bad luck! As if grief were a contagion. The faces in the small crowd that had gathered had been a gallery of grim disapproval, a few tinged with a pity so shallow it was more insulting than comforting. Now, with the hostile settlement receding behind them, a smudge of impotent anger against the vast, indifferent sky, the true weight of their predicament pressed down upon Ilara. The air, thin and sharp, burned in her lungs with each ragged inhalation. The sun, a pale disk in the grey wash of the heavens, offered no warmth, only a stark illumination of their isolation. Leah and Mara, bundled in every layer Ilara could spare, huddled together on the wagon seat, their small faces pale, their eyes wide with a fear they were too young to fully comprehend but old enough to absorb from the marrow-deep terror radiating from their mother. "Mama," Leah whispered, her voice trembling like a trapped bird, "are we going to find a new home soon?" Ilara forced a smile that felt like a crack in frozen earth. "Soon, my darlings. Very soon. We just need to keep looking." But her gaze swept the horizon, a desolate canvas of brown and grey, stretching endlessly, offering nothing but more hardship. The wind whipped a strand of her dull brown hair across her face, stinging her eyes, and she tasted the salt of unshed tears. Despair was a cold, coiling serpent in her belly, its venom seeping into her veins, whispering of surrender. How could she protect them? How could she provide when the world itself seemed determined to break them? The creak of the wagon wheels, a mournful groan, was the only sound that dared to challenge the wind's dominion, a slow, agonizing dirge for their fading hopes. Each rotation was a step further into the unknown, further from any semblance of safety, closer to the precipice of utter desolation. The vastness of the land was a physical oppression, a crushing weight that threatened to extinguish the last spark of her maternal resolve. She pulled the girls closer, their small bodies a fragile warmth against her own chilled form, a desperate, silent vow forming in the crucible of her fear. She would not let this land, or the cruelty of men, claim them too. The days that followed bled into a monotonous cycle of grim perseverance and dwindling hope. Ilara pushed westward, though the direction held no specific promise, only a desperate instinct to keep moving, to outrun the gnawing despair that threatened to consume her. The landscape remained stubbornly unforgiving, a vast, undulating tapestry of muted browns and ochres, broken only by skeletal trees and the occasional outcrop of hostile rock. Each sunrise brought a renewed, hollow ache of hunger and the chilling reminder of their meager supplies. The sack of flour was nearly empty, the salted meat reduced to a few precious scraps. Thomas had been the hunter, the provider. Ilara's skills lay in mending clothes and nurturing a small garden, talents utterly useless in this barren wilderness. She tried to shield Leah and Mara from the worst of her anxieties, her voice unnaturally bright as she pointed out a distant hawk circling all the way the frost painted delicate patterns on the sparse grasses. But their innocent eyes, large and shadowed, reflected her own unspoken fears. Leah, always the more fragile of the twins, had developed a persistent cough, a dry, rasping sound that tore at Ilara's heart with every utterance. Mara, bless her stoic little soul, tried to be brave, mimicking her mother's forced optimism, but at night, Ilara would hear her soft whimpers as she burrowed closer to her sister for warmth and comfort. They found temporary refuge one evening in the shallow lee of a large rock formation, the stone offering a slight break from the incessant wind. Ilara managed a small fire, carefully husbanding their last few pieces of wood. The meager warmth did little to dispel the encroaching chill of the night, or the deeper chill of her own failing spirit. She measured out the last of the cornmeal, her hands trembling as she mixed it with water to make a thin, unsatisfying gruel. "Is this all, Mama?" Leah asked, her voice small and weak, her eyes fixed on the pitiful portion in her tin cup. Ilara's throat tightened. "It's enough for tonight, sweetling. Tomorrow, we'll find more. I promise." But the promise felt like a lie, heavy and bitter on her tongue. She had no idea how they would find more. The land offered nothing but thorns and stones. As darkness enveloped them, a deeper, more menacing shadow began to gather on the horizon. The wind, which had been a constant, mournful companion, shifted, growing angrier, its voice rising to a guttural howl. The sky, already a dull, oppressive grey, darkened further, pregnant with an unshed fury. A storm was coming. Ilara felt it in her bones, a primal dread that resonated with the turmoil in her soul. She checked the canvas cover on the wagon, securing it as best she could, though she knew it would offer little protection against a true prairie blizzard. The girls, sensing the shift in the atmosphere and their mother's renewed anxiety, huddled closer together beneath their shared blanket, their small faces etched with worry. Ilara sat with her back against the cold stone, the wind tearing at her, listening to Leah's worsening cough. Each raspy breath was a fresh stab of guilt, a reminder of her inability to protect her child. She felt so utterly alone, a tiny, insignificant speck in the face of nature's vast, indifferent power. The first snowflakes began to fall, not gentle, feathery flakes, but hard, stinging pellets driven by the ferocious wind. They were a harbinger of the onslaught to come, a cruel mockery of the gentle snowfalls she remembered from her childhood, snowfalls that had meant warmth, and family, and safety. Here, they meant only another layer of suffering, another threat to their fragile existence. The light of their small fire flickered and struggled against the rising gale, its brave glow shrinking, a metaphor for her own waning strength. The storm descended with the ferocity of a starving wolf, a maelstrom of biting wind and blinding snow. The shallow alcove against the rock face, their only refuge, proved woefully inadequate. Snow whipped in from all sides, quickly covering their meager blankets, seeping into their clothes, chilling them to the bone. The fire, despite Ilara's desperate attempts to shield it, hissed and died, plunging them into a deeper, more terrifying darkness, broken only by the ghostly white swirl of the blizzard. Ilara wrapped her arms around Leah and Mara, pulling them tight against her, trying to share what little body heat she had left. Leah's coughing fits were more frequent now, each one sounding weaker, more ragged. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara's exhaustion. They would not survive this. Not out here. Not like this. Just as the last vestiges of her resolve began to crumble, just as a numb resignation started to creep into her soul, a shape materialized through the swirling chaos. At first, she thought it a delusion, a figment of her freezing, exhausted mind. But it grew more substantial, resolving into the forms of several figures on horseback, dark silhouettes against the white fury of the storm. Fear, primal and immediate, surged through Ilara. Raiders? Hostile tribesmen she had heard whispered tales of back east. She clutched her daughters tighter, instinctively trying to shield them with her own body, a futile gesture against an unknown threat. The figures dismounted, moving with a silent, unnerving efficiency. One, taller than the others, his form commanding even in the dim, storm-tossed light, approached. He wore furs and hides, practical and well-suited to the brutal weather, so unlike the threadbare coats of the settlers. His face, framed by long, dark hair, was stern, his features sharply defined, his eyes dark and piercing as they took in their desperate situation. He was, Ilara realized with a jolt that was part terror, part something else she couldn't name, a native warrior. A Cheyenne, perhaps, given the territory. This was Keem, though she did not know his name then. He offered no greeting, no word of threat or comfort. His gaze swept over Ilara, lingering on the children, then assessed the flimsy shelter, the dead fire, the pervasive evidence of their suffering. His expression remained unreadable, carved from stone, yet in the set of his jaw, the intensity of his focus, there was a formidable presence. His companions, equally silent, equally formidable, fanned out, their movements economical and purposeful. They seemed impervious to the storm, as if it were a familiar, if unwelcome, acquaintance. One quickly began to gather what dry tinder he could find from beneath the overhang, his skill in the near-impossible conditions a stark contrast to Ilara's own failures. Another produced a thick buffalo robe from his horse and, without a word, draped it over the shivering forms of Leah and Mara. The warmth, the sheer unexpectedness of the gesture, was so overwhelming that Ilara could only stare, momentarily stunned into silence. Her fear was still a living thing, coiling in her stomach, but it was now complicated by a desperate, fragile flicker of something akin to hope. These men, these savages as the settlers would call them, moved with a competence, a mastery of this harsh environment, that was utterly lacking in those who had cast her out. Keen watched her, his gaze steady. He did not smile, nor did he scowl. He simply observed, his silence more potent than any words could have been. The cultural chasm between them felt as vast and cold as the storm itself. Yet, in this moment of shared crisis, in this vortex of wind and snow, their humanity, stripped bare, faced each other across that divide. He was the unknown, the potential danger, but he was also, perhaps, their only chance. Keen gestured, a brief, decisive movement of his hand, and one of his men produced a water skin and a small pouch. From the pouch, he carefully measured out a portion of dried meat, pounded fine, and some dark, crumbled herbs. He offered it to Ilara, his expression as impassive as his leader's. Ilara hesitated, her mind a battleground of ingrained prejudice and desperate maternal instinct. The story she'd heard, the warnings of Indian treachery, warred with the undeniable evidence of Leah's weakening state and the gnawing hunger that twisted her own insides. Leah coughed again, a thin, painful sound that seemed to echo in the sudden, focused silence of the warriors. That sound, more than anything, broke through Ilara's fear. She reached out a trembling hand and accepted the offering. The warrior then motioned towards Leah, a questioning look in his eyes as he indicated the herbs. Ilara, understanding his unspoken query about her daughter's illness, nodded mutely. He mixed a small portion of the herbs with a little water from the skin and, with surprising gentleness, indicated that Leah should drink it. Keen watched this exchange, his dark eyes missing nothing. He spoke a few low words in his own tongue, words Ilara could not understand, but the tone was one of quiet authority. His men worked with remarkable speed and skill. Within minutes, they had reinforced the meager shelter, using their own bodies and blankets to block the worst of the wind and snow. Another warrior, with an almost magical ability, coaxed a small flame to life from the damp wood, building it carefully into a steady, resilient fire that pushed back the biting cold and the oppressive darkness. The sudden warmth was a physical shock, a blessing so profound Ilara felt tears sting her eyes. Keen, seeing her reaction, turned his gaze away, affording her a moment of privacy in her relief. He himself did little of the physical labor, his presence seeming to direct and unify the efforts of his men. He was a leader, that much was clear, accustomed to command and to being obeyed without question. He indicated, through a combination of gestures and a few surprisingly intelligible English words spoken by one of his warriors, stay. Storm pass. That they would remain until the weather broke. Ilara, huddled by the new fire, her daughters nestled between her and the welcome heat, felt a cautious gratitude begin to thaw the ice of her fear. These men, who could have easily ignored them, or worse, harmed them, had instead offered shelter, warmth, and medicine. Their actions were practical, devoid of sentimentality, yet profoundly impactful. Leah, after sipping the herbal mixture, seemed to relax slightly, her coughing easing a little. Mara, wide-eyed and silent, watched the warriors with a mixture of awe and apprehension, her small hand clutching Ilara's tightly. The Cheyenne warrior settled around the fire, their movements economical, their presence filling the small space but not in a threatening way. They were a part of this wild land, attuned to its rhythms, its dangers, and its sparse comforts. Ilara found herself observing Keen. his stoicism was a shield, but behind it, she sensed a deep well of capability, an unwavering strength that was as much a part of him as the harsh landscape was a part of his existence. The night wore on, the storm continuing its assault outside their small haven. Inside, an uneasy truce prevailed, a fragile bubble of shared warmth and reluctant reliance in the heart of the blizzard. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the howl of the wind, and Leah's now softer breathing. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elara allowed herself a sliver of hope, as thin and precious as the first light of dawn after a long, dark night. The storm raged for 2 full days, imprisoning them in their rocky alcove. The forced proximity created an atmosphere thick with unspoken tensions and dawning awareness. Elara, acutely conscious of their savior's presence, divided her attention between caring for her daughters and observing Keem and his men. The Cheyenne warriors were a study in disciplined stillness when not actively engaged in tasks. They spoke little, their communication often consisting of subtle gestures or brief, guttural exchanges that Elara could not comprehend. Yet, there was an undeniable cohesion among them, a silent understanding that spoke of shared experiences and deep-rooted loyalty. Keem remained the focal point of her observation. He rarely spoke directly to her, the language barrier a formidable wall. When he did, it was usually through the warrior who knew some English, a man named Black Owl, whose translations were often clipped and utilitarian. Yet, Keem's eyes were expressive, conveying a depth of thought and awareness that transcended words. He watched her too, his gaze steady and assessing. Elara sensed he was gauging her resilience, her character, the depth of her maternal devotion. She tried to maintain a dignified composure, despite her tattered appearance and the overwhelming sense of vulnerability. She focused on her daughters, tending to Leah's needs with a quiet determination, ensuring Mara felt secure. She shared the food they provided, always offering it to the girls first, a small act of maternal sacrifice that did not go unnoticed by the keen-eyed chief. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sharp edges of Elara's fear began to soften. These men were not the fearsome caricatures from settlers' tales. They were warriors, yes, hard and capable, but there was no malice in their actions towards her and her children. Their assistance was practical, efficient, driven by a code she didn't understand but was beginning to respect. Keem would occasionally make a subtle gesture, a nod towards the dwindling woodpile, which one of his men would then replenish, or a glance at the children's thin blankets, followed by another thick for being silently added to their bedding. These small, almost invisible acts of consideration spoke volumes. Leah's fever, under the influence of the herbs and the consistent warmth, finally broke on the second day. The relief that washed over Elara was immense, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She murmured her thanks, looking towards Keem, who met her gaze with his usual stoic expression, though she thought she detected a flicker of something, satisfaction, in the depths of his dark eyes before he turned away. The twins, initially terrified, began to show flickers of childish curiosity. Mara, bolder than her sister, would sometimes peek at the warriors from behind Elara's skirt, her eyes wide. One of the younger warriors, perhaps noticing her furtive glances, carved a small, rough bird from a piece of scrap wood and, with a slight, almost shy inclination of his head, left it near where Mara sat today. The girl's gasp of delight was a small, bright sound in the otherwise subdued atmosphere. Elara saw Keem observe this interaction, his face unreadable, but he did not intervene. It was a tiny bridge across a vast divide, a moment of shared humanity. The fire became the center of their temporary world, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the rock walls, creating an illusion of intimacy in their enforced confinement. The aroma of wood smoke, dried meat, and unfamiliar herbs filled the small space, a scent Elara knew she would forever associate with this strange, life-altering interlude. She was learning, through observation, that survival in this land required a different kind of strength than she had known, a strength rooted in knowledge, respect for the elements, and a profound connection to the earth, qualities embodied by Keem and his men. When the storm finally subsided on the third morning, it left behind a world transformed, draped in a pristine, blinding white. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the air, though frigid, was still and clean. The silence, after the relentless howl of the blizzard, was profound. Keem surveyed the altered landscape, his expression thoughtful. Then, through Black Owl, he conveyed his decision, they would take Ilara and her daughters to their village. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat, a wild mix of apprehension and a desperate, clinging hope. To go with them meant venturing further into an unknown world, into the heart of a culture she had been taught to fear. But what was the alternative? To remain here, with her dwindling supplies and broken wagon, was a death sentence. The settlers had made it clear there was no sanctuary for them in their world. She looked at Leah, pale but breathing easier, and at Mara, whose eyes already held a spark of cautious adventure. For their sakes, she had no real choice. She nodded her assent, a lump of trepidation lodged in her throat. The journey was arduous. The snow lay deep in many places, making progress slow. Ilara, unaccustomed to such harsh travel, struggled to keep pace, her worn boots ill-suited for the conditions. Keem, noticing her difficulty, gestured for one of his men to bring forward a sturdy pony. He then indicated, with a curt nod, that Ilara should ride. The gesture, though practical, felt like another small act of unexpected consideration. Leah and Mara, bundled securely in furs, were placed on other ponies, guided carefully by the experienced warriors. They looked like tiny, precious bundles amidst the vastness of the snow-covered plains. Keem rode at the head of the small party, his posture erect, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon. He moved with an innate confidence, a deep understanding of the land that was both humbling and reassuring to Ilara. He seemed to read the contours of the earth, the subtle signs in the snow, the direction of the wind, as easily as she might read a book. He chose paths that, while challenging, offered the most direct route and the best protection from the elements. The landscape slowly began to change. The flat, featureless plains gradually gave way to rolling hills, dotted with stands of pine and juniper that had managed to cling to life in the harsh climate. The air felt different here, less exposed, holding the faint scent of wood smoke and evergreen. Ilara found herself contrasting the Cheyenne's quiet competence with the loud, often fearful, pronouncements of the settlers she had encountered. The settlers sought to conquer the land, to bend it to their will, and often seemed to live in a state of perpetual anxiety about its dangers. These men, however, seemed to be a part of it, moving through it with a respect and knowledge that bred a quiet fearlessness. Ilara, riding behind Keem, observed his every move, the way he sat his horse, the subtle shifts in his attention, the unspoken commands he gave to his men. He was an enigma, a man of few words but immense presence. She wondered about his life, his people, the burdens of leadership he clearly carried. Her fear of him, and of his people, had not entirely vanished, but it was being steadily eroded by a growing respect and a fragile, tentative trust born of shared hardship and undeniable aid. He was, in this moment, their protector, their guide through a world that had seemed intent on destroying them. The silence of the journey was broken only by the crunch of hooves on snow, the occasional low word from one of the warriors, or the sigh of the wind through the pines. It was a silence that allowed for thought, for observation, and for the slow, almost imperceptible, shifting of Ilara's rigidly held beliefs. The arrival at the Cheyenne encampment was, for Ilara, like stepping into another world, a world utterly alien and initially overwhelming. Nestled in a wide, sheltered valley, bisected by a frozen river, the village was a collection of conical lodges, their smoke-stained hides a stark contrast against the snow. Dogs barked at their approach, and figures emerged from the lodges, their faces turning towards the returning party with expressions of curiosity that quickly shifted to undisguised scrutiny as they caught sight of Ilara and her pale-haired daughters. A new wave of fear, sharper and more acute than what she had felt in the wilderness, washed over Ilara. Here, she was not just an outsider, she was a potential threat, a symbol of the encroaching white world that had brought so much disruption and sorrow to the native peoples. She clutched Leah and Mara closer, her instinct to protect them flaring fiercely. The villagers murmured amongst themselves, their dark eyes missing nothing, her tattered dress, her worn face, the fear she couldn't entirely conceal. The gazes were not overtly hostile, not yet, but they were wary, appraising, and deeply unsettling. Keem dismounted and spoke to a group of elders who had come forward to meet him. His voice was low and authoritative, and though Ilara could not understand the words, she could sense the respect he commanded. He gestured towards her and the children, his explanation seemingly brief and to the point. The elders listened impassively, their weathered faces inscrutable. After a moment of silence that stretched Ilara's nerves to their breaking point, one of the elders, a man with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages, nodded slowly. Keem then led Ilara and her daughters towards a smaller, unoccupied lodge near the edge of the village. It was basic, furnished with a few furs and a central fire pit, but it was shelter, a haven from the biting wind and the curious stares. Black Owl, the warrior who spoke some English, informed her curtly, "You stay here," Keem says. And then he was gone, leaving Ilara alone with her children in this strange, new environment. The initial hours were a torment of anxiety. Ilara felt more isolated than she had in the empty plains, surrounded now by people whose language, customs, and thoughts were entirely foreign to her. She kept the girls close, speaking to them in hushed whispers, trying to project a calm she did not feel. The sounds of the village drifted in, the rhythmic chop of wood, the cries of children at play, the melodic cadence of unfamiliar voices, all reminders of her profound otherness. Food was brought to them later, a stew of meat and wild vegetables, simple but nourishing. It was delivered by a woman whose face was stern but not unkind. She set the wooden bowl down without a word and left as silently as she had come. Ilara ate sparingly, ensuring Leah and Mara had their fill first. The twins, exhausted from the journey and the preceding ordeal, soon fell asleep, nestled together under the furs. Ilara, however, could not rest. She sat by the small, smoky fire, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the night, her mind racing. What did Keem intend for them? Were they prisoners? Honored guests? Or simply a burden he had taken on out of some obscure sense of duty? She saw his actions as life-saving, yet she knew her presence here was an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order of this community. She was a white woman, a settler, the very type of person whose arrival often signaled conflict and loss for these people. The weight of that knowledge, and the uncertainty of their future, pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Days bled into weeks, each one a slow unfolding of cautious adaptation. Ilara understood that their survival in the Cheyenne camp depended on their ability to be unobtrusive and, if possible, useful. She began by keeping their small lodge meticulously tidy, a small act of order in a world that felt chaotic to her senses. Soon, one of the older women, perhaps taking pity on her idleness or testing her willingness, gestured for Ilara to help with the endless task of scraping and preparing hides. The work was physically demanding, her hands quickly becoming chapped and sore, but Ilara applied herself with a quiet diligence. She watched the Cheyenne women, their movements economical and skilled, their chatter a musical but incomprehensible backdrop to their labor. She learned by observing, by mimicking their actions, by slowly, painstakingly, trying to absorb the rhythms of their daily lives. She was given other tasks, gathering firewood, mending torn buckskin clothing with an awl and sinew, a far cry from the fine needlework she was used to, and helping to grind corn with a heavy stone pestle. Each task was a small step away from the helplessness she had felt on the plains. The language remained a significant barrier, a thick curtain between her and the community. Yet, through gestures, through shared tasks, and through the universal language of a mother's concern for her children, small connections began to form. A woman might offer a rare smile when Ilara finally mastered a particular technique, or another might gently correct her fumbling attempts to pronounce a Cheyenne word. Leah and Mara, with the natural adaptability of children, fared better. Though initially shy, their curiosity soon outweighed their fear. They would watch the Cheyenne children at play, their games so different from any they had known. Gradually, they were drawn into the fringes of these games, their blonde hair a stark contrast to the dark braids of their new playmates. Ilara watched them with a mixture of anxiety and relief, grateful for any sign of normalcy, yet ever aware of their precarious position. Keem remained a distant but powerful presence. Ilara rarely saw him up close, and when she did, he would usually offer a curt nod of acknowledgement, his dark eyes assessing her, before moving on. She knew, however, that his unspoken decree protected them. No one overtly mistreated them, though she often felt the weight of curious or suspicious stares. She learned that he had lost his own wife and young son to a fever spread by white traders years before, a piece of information gleaned from Black Owl during a rare moment of guarded communication. This knowledge cast his initial act of rescue in a new light, hinting at a depth of understanding, perhaps even a shared sorrow, that lay beneath his stoic exterior. She began to shed some of her ingrained prejudices, the simplistic and fearful notions she had held about Indians. She saw their strong family bonds, their deep respect for nature, their resilience in the face of hardship, and the richness of their culture, so different from her own, yet possessing its own profound wisdom. She saw their laughter, their grief, their everyday struggles and joys. Her own resilience, tempered in the crucible of loss and desperation, continued to deepen. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance, she was a survivor, learning to navigate a new and challenging world, driven by the unwavering imperative to protect her daughters. The rhythm of the village, once alien and jarring, began to feel less threatening, more familiar. The smoke from the lodges, the scent of roasting meat, the sounds of drums in the evening, these things were slowly weaving themselves into the fabric of her new, uncertain existence. The fragile peace of their existence was shattered by the early, brutal arrival of a deep winter. Snows, heavier and more persistent than usual, blanketed the valley, trapping the Cheyenne in their lodges for days on end. Game became scarce as animals sought deeper shelter, and the carefully hoarded supplies of dried meat and berries began to dwindle at an alarming rate. A palpable tension settled over the village. Anxious murmurs replaced the usual cheerful chatter, and the faces of the elders grew increasingly grim. Elara, keenly aware of their tenuous position, felt the shift acutely. The presence of 3 extra mouths, white mouths at that, became a more visible burden. She overheard snippets of conversations, her slowly improving understanding of the Cheyenne language allowing her to grasp the core of their concerns. Some tribe members, their own families facing hunger, began to cast resentful glances towards her lodge. The unspoken question hung heavy in the frigid air: why should they share their precious resources with outsiders, symbols of the very people who were encroaching on their lands and threatening their way of life? Elara redoubled her efforts to contribute. She spent hours mending worn-out winter clothing and moccasins, her fingers often numb with cold, her skill with a needle, honed over years of making her own family's clothes, proving surprisingly valuable. She helped the women stretch and soften the few hides that were brought in, working tirelessly, hoping to demonstrate her worth, her gratitude, her desperation not to be cast out again. Leah and Mara, sensing the change in atmosphere, clung to her more closely, their youthful exuberance subdued. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, confining everyone to their lodges, the tension reached a breaking point. A warrior named Stone Hand, known for his quick temper and his distrust of whites, entered Keem's lodge where the chief was meeting with his council. His voice, loud and angry, carried through the thin hide walls to where Elara sat with her children, her heart pounding. Though she could not make out all the words, the accusatory tone was unmistakable. He was challenging Keem's decision to harbor them, arguing that they were a drain, a bad omen. The welfare of the tribe, he declared, must come first. Elara's blood ran cold. This was it. The moment she had dreaded. She could picture the scene: Stone Hand, gesticulating angrily, the other council members listening, their faces grim. Keem's response, when it came, was low and measured, yet it carried an undeniable weight of authority that seemed to cut through Stone Hand's bluster. There was a period of charged silence, then the sound of Stone Hand departing, his footsteps heavy with displeasure but no longer aggressive. Later, Black Owl came to her lodge. His face was serious. "Keem faces much talk," he said, his English more halting than usual. "Some say you bring trouble, bad winter." Elara looked at him, her own face pale but resolute. "We do not wish to be a burden," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We are grateful for the shelter, for the food. I will work. My daughters, they are just children." Black Owl simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and left. Elara knew that Keem had defended them, had stood against the rising tide of resentment. But for how long? The winter showed no signs of abating, and the hunger in the village was a gnawing, ever-present reality. Her own small store of carefully saved food scraps felt pitifully inadequate against the vastness of their need. The crisis deepened with the news, brought by a pair of returning scouts, that a large herd of buffalo, driven south by even harsher weather in the north, had been sighted several days' journey away. It was a potential salvation, but the hunt would be perilous in the extreme conditions, requiring every able-bodied man. The discussion in Keem's lodge that night was long and intense. Ilara, unable to sleep, listened to the rise and fall of voices, her anxiety a tight knot in her chest. If the hunt failed, or if too many men were lost, the fragile balance of the village would shatter, and her own fate, and that of her daughters, would be sealed. Before dawn, the hunting party, led by Keem, departed into the frozen, grey landscape. A somber mood fell over the village, a compound of hope and dread. The women, children, and old men who remained went about their tasks with a grim determination, their thoughts with the hunters. Ilara worked alongside the other women, her earlier skills in preserving food, learned from her own mother in a time that felt a lifetime ago, now proving unexpectedly useful. She showed them a way to better smoke the small rabbits and squirrels the boys managed to trap, extending their longevity. She knew a little about edible roots and tubers that could be found even under shallow snow, knowledge gleaned from a tattered almanac her father had cherished. These were small contributions, perhaps, but in this time of desperate need, every little bit helped. Days passed in a slow agony of waiting. The wind howled relentlessly, and the cold was a constant, invasive presence. Leah's cough returned, a rasping echo of Ilara's deepest fears. One evening, as Ilara tended a sputtering fire, trying to coax a little more warmth into their lodge, Keem's elderly mother, a woman named Walks with Sun, entered. She had been mostly aloof, observing Ilara with an unreadable expression. Tonight, however, her gaze seemed softer. She carried a small bundle of herbs. Without a word, she prepared a poultice and, with surprising gentleness, showed Ilara how to apply it to Leah's chest. Then, she spoke, her voice raspy with age, in slow, deliberate Cheyenne, pointing to Ilara, then to Leah, then to her own heart. A mother's heart, she seemed to say, is the same, in any language. Ilara, tears welling in her eyes, could only nod, a profound sense of connection passing between them, woman to woman, mother to mother. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a shout went up from the edge of the village. The hunters were returning. Ilara rushed out with the others, her heart pounding. They were weary, frostbitten, some bearing injuries, but they had been successful. Traver laden with meat followed them into the camp. Relief, so potent it was almost painful, washed through the village. Keem, his face etched with exhaustion but also with a quiet triumph, sought Ilara's gaze across the bustling scene. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of personal triumph, but of shared survival. In that moment, something shifted within Ilara, and perhaps within the village as well. She had not just been a passive recipient of aid, she had contributed, in her own small way, to their collective endurance. The immediate threat of starvation had passed, not just because of the hunters' bravery, but because of the combined efforts of everyone, including the white woman and her children whom Keem had chosen to protect. That night, the drums beat in the village, a sound not of anxiety, but of gratitude and renewed hope. The aroma of roasting meat filled the air, a promise of sustenance and life. Ilara watched Leah and Mara, their faces finally losing the pinched look of hunger, and a quiet sense of peace, fragile but real, settled over her. They had faced the worst, together, and had, for now, endured. The harsh sanctuary had held.